Welcome to Diplomacy at Risk. This is a program series that looks at the current threat to American diplomacy, its impact on the American people, and what we can do about the issue. Today, we're going to talk about refugees and human rights, and we're going to examine why it's important to support sustainable solutions for refugees, people displaced due to conflict, and stateless persons. We're also going to look at the protection of refugee rights and human rights across the globe and how that helps ensure a peaceful, more prosperous world for American citizens in the United States and abroad. I'm very pleased today to have as our guest, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. It's good to have you here. It's always good to see you.
Thank you, Bill. Delighted to be here.
Well, you've had a long and distinguished career at the Department of State. Could you talk a little bit about how you decided to join the Foreign Service and maybe a little bit before you were in the Foreign Service, to give us a little background about you?
You know, I think the Foreign Service found me. I'm from Louisiana. So people in Louisiana don't know much about the Foreign Service or diplomacy, but I happened to go to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, and there I discovered the study of Africa, became in fact, what I like to refer to now as an Africanist, and got the opportunity to go to Liberia to do research. And that's all she wrote. I have been, since that time, been an avid follower of events in Africa. I joined the Foreign Service in 1982 after taking the Foreign Service exam, and I've been in for 35 years. And
your focus on Liberia in particular continues, as you were the ambassador to Liberia.
I was the ambassador to Liberia. It was an interesting, I describe my career as circles. I always go back to where I started. So I was in Liberia in 1978, and then I got the opportunity in 2008 to go to Liberia as the ambassador.
Great. Well, and you were Assistant Secretary for Africa, but you also were a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the PRM, the Refugee Migration Population, Refugee, and Migration Bureau. And I think if you could talk just a little bit about the refugee situation in the world today. I think one of the problems people have is there's a lot, refugees is used as a catch-all term, and that really does not explain what goes on and how they are related to international humanitarian law and that sort of thing. So if you could talk about the current situation in the world about refugees.
You know, I actually started working on refugee issues in 1989, and I eventually ended up going to Kenya. And Kenya had a major refugee crisis during that period. I was there from 93 to 96, and there were about 150,000, 200,000 refugees in Kenya from Somalia and from Sudan. And I actually thought that there was a solution to the situation, that eventually we would find a workable solution that would provide opportunities for these refugees to eventually go home. Fast forward almost 20 years, and I am Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And now there are 400,000 refugees in Kenya. And right now, as we speak, there are over 1 million refugees in Uganda. And there are millions of refugees across the globe. Syria, for example, has the largest refugee population in the world. And what are refugees? Refugees are people who are fleeing their countries because of being persecuted, because of their religion, because of their beliefs, because of their politics, and because their governments do not respect their human rights.
Could you talk just a little bit about, during your career, you were in Kenya, you were in Geneva, coordinating things, but about your interactions with refugees as a refugee officer in the field?
You know, I thought as the refugee coordinator in the field, it was my job to engage with refugees. And so I spent a lot of time in refugee camps. talking to refugees, but also trying to figure out what their needs were, what their desires were, what their hopes were in the future. And in one of those situations where I visited refugees, I happened to be in Rwanda during the genocide that occurred in 1994. And I'd gone to Rwanda to look at the Burundi refugee situation, not knowing that I myself would be caught in this event. And pretty much for a few hours of my life became a refugee myself as we were fleeing Rwanda, fleeing the carnage until I was able to get into Burundi and was evacuated back to my home in Nairobi, Kenya. So it's being a refugee is not a comfortable situation to be in because it's a life and death situation.
And I guess if you could just, if you're an American in Louisiana or Michigan or Minnesota, why should they care about refugees? They're somewhere else.
You know, I get asked that question all the time, Bill. And what I say to people is Americans care. We are a caring country. And refugees are people who are people in need. And many of those refugees have had the fortune of being resettled in the United States. And they are getting the gift of hope in our country because our country is so generous as it relates to refugees. And so I think we care because it is a core value of our country that we care about people who are in need.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit, because you're passionate about this, it's not just a job.
No.
What first sparked your interest in the Refugee Bureau, the refugee issues?
That's an interesting question. I was on assignment in the Gambia back in 1989 when Mauritanian were kicked out of Senegal and were forced into refugee status in the Gambia. At that point, I didn't know what a refugee was. I didn't know how to support them, but it was my job. And so I figured it out, being in touch with the Refugee Bureau then in Washington, and figured out what my responsibilities were. And it was something that I felt good about, not the situation of the refugees, but the fact that I could do something that would make a difference in their lives. And it became a lifetime love for me. And I ended up spending more than half of my career working on refugee issues.
And sort of one final question, how does the United States government, the Africa Bureau, the Refugee Bureau interact with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the UN's mandated organization to deal with refugees?
You know, the United States is the most generous donor to the UN's refugee and humanitarian programs. So for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, during the time that I was working on these issues, we provided about 25% of their annual needs to support refugees, as well as other organizations. So with that money, it gave us a voice in how those organizations operated and how they functioned, and also what their priorities were.
It's a pleasure to have with us today Virginia Bennett, who was the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
And could you start out by telling us a little bit about your background and decision to get into the Foreign Service, to make that a career?
You know, when I was a kid, I went on a family vacation to Hawaii. And we went to Pearl Harbor, and I think it was the first time that I began to understand both the reality that things that happen far, far away from where we live have enormous impact on America and its people, and also of the criticality of America's leadership role, that when we get into a fight, we leave incredibly durable and indelible footprints on the world. Right. And in general, for the better.
Well, that makes sense.
And it seemed awfully appealing. And I also, you know, I mean, I think it really piqued my curiosity. And I wanted to see all the, I don't know, kind of nooks and crannies of the world where America was out demonstrating our leadership capacity.
Could you talk a little bit about human rights? I'm not sure everybody understands exactly what human rights are, or if they apply to everybody or just certain people.
I think that human rights are fundamentally about our humanity. Every individual has the immutable right to live the way they want to think the way they want to think, to believe in whatever God they wish to believe in. They are free and you know, I mean, individuals who have an incredible capacity to dream and want and to be. And when those naturally human tendencies are abrogated, whether because of an autocratic leader, or when someone is persecuted and told not to believe in what they do believe in, you know, fundamentally that is at odds with the very nature of humanity. And I think that the reason that America has long exercised a leadership role in the international treatment, as it were, of the human rights question is because individual liberty as a concept is so deeply ingrained in us as Americans. We also just generally believe that people should have the right to be happy. And, you know, I think that we have long exercised actually a very positive influence in many, many places by helping people seek justice, seek freedom, and you know, a better future for themselves and ultimately for global stability, I think, overall.
Okay, good. Could you talk a little bit about how your bureau at the State Department would interact with bilateral donors and the multilateral donors, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and how we exert our influence, perform our advocacy and that sort of thing on behalf for human rights?
I think first and foremost, what we tried to do was support the people who were seeking justice. And again, whether it was because of a particular, you know, a particular group, the Christian minority perhaps in, you know, in any geographic region, you know, seeking to support those who would help individuals, seeking to support those who might help highlight crimes or corruption on the part of a government, and seeking to support those. And when I say those, I really mean both victims and activists and defenders of human rights. Maybe it's the attorneys who are actually defending clients in the defending clients in the context of a local legal system. So that there was that piece of it from the foreign assistance front, and I have to say, we really did quite a lot with a very modest amount of money. We're not talking about big dollars at all in this regard. And then there is sort of the policy side and having, you know, frank and you know, candid conversations with governments about why we have different views. I remember one of the bilateral human rights dialogues that I participated in during my tenure, and the government in question had a lot of criticisms about the United States, about our own record on racial equality and police violence and so on and so forth, all of which were, frankly, points of view he had come to because we have a free and fair and transparent press, and we don't sweep such things under the carpet in the United States. We try in an aspirational way to make them better. And anyway, so I'll stop there, but.
Okay, could you talk a little bit about, for someone who's not intimately involved in sort of the human rights issue and maybe diplomacy, how does focusing on human rights further U.S. security or U.S. interests?
I think that when people are deprived of what they want, over time that creates a fundamental divisiveness within a culture. It creates, I mean, humans have an incredible spirit that eventually if they are repressed for long enough and severely enough, there will be a reckoning. I genuinely believe that. It's what induced individuals to get on boats and sail across the Atlantic to seek a better life in the United States. It is what has led to the incredible diversity of the United States population. It is, I mean, it's this, the impulse to seek a better life will always win out. And sometimes that happens in a conflict setting or a wave of migrants and refugees. If you're persecuted at home, you need to go find a better life. And all of these things, as we've seen, frankly, with Syria and other major conflicts, that is not really conducive to global stability.
I guess to follow up with that, I guess to me it's still talking to the average American about the relationship. There seems to be a relationship between refugees and human rights. And do you guys focus, did you focus on that nexus during your time as the Assistant Secretary?
I mean, I think you can't really separate the the reasons for which refugee flows are created from, in most cases, human rights violations. In certain very, very challenging societies, people don't even have the right to get out or the right to leave. But there is a reason that every year a considerable number of individuals flee across the border between the DPRK and South Korea, North Korea and South Korea. There's a reason that an incredible number of Syrians have picked up and have, at immense peril to themselves and their families, have taken flight. And the litany of those, there are many, many, many examples that goes on. So you can't, people don't leave their families, their hometown, their homes, unless conditions are so appalling. And usually, some other human being has created those appalling conditions. Not always. I mean, there are natural disasters, but more often than not, it has to do with exceptionally poor, governance.
And just with the increase in the number of fragile states and conflict-affected states around the world, I see this intensifying.
I think that's right. I mean, whether it's because of impunity for crime in a country that's ridden with gang activity, when people are threatened, it is a common denominator that they will seek safety. And if that means they have to get up and go, then they will.
It's a pleasure today to have both of our experts here together to talk about human rights and refugee issues. Is Virginia Bennett and Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. So I'm glad and welcome both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would appreciate, you both worked in different bureaus but on related issues. You in the Africa Bureau and PRM, you in the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department. From your perspective, could you talk about the interrelationships between human rights and refugees? Or broadly migration?
If I could start, I see refugees as being an outgrowth of countries that violate human rights of their people. Countries where governance is lacking, countries where press freedoms are lacking, and countries where governments do not take care of their people. So when that happens in a country, people vote with their feet. They leave, they cross borders to go into other countries where they feel safety.
I might just chime in here too and note that, I think that the modern era treatment of human rights as a question really came to the fore in the aftermath of the Second World War. And both the appalling treatment of individuals at the hands of their own governments in various areas, both in Asia and in Europe, but the extraordinary population flows that were generated by that conflict. You really can't separate these two issues.
And it was at that time that the Geneva Convention was agreed to, which required countries who were on the receiving end of refugee flows to provide protection to people who cross their borders because of fear of persecution. And those rules and practices exist still today.
I guess if I could just raise one question, the one large group of migrant populations that are not really protected under any of these rules or regulations, and maybe in the future should be something we think about, are the internally displaced folks, most often displaced by conflict.
And many of those people are fleeing from their homes, but staying within their borders for the same reason that people are crossing borders.
Right.
So some cross borders and some move from the security or insecurity in their homes to move into another location in their country where they might feel safer. And so they are leaving and moving for the same reason, and they should be provided the same protections for that same reason.
I served in Colombia, which at the time I was there had, I think it was the third largest internally displaced persons population, that's a mouthful, in the world. And it was because people were fleeing an armed insurgency against the government. And they feared for their lives, and so they voted with their feet.
How do you, or how does the State Department advocate for policies related to human rights and refugees with the United Nations and other bilateral donors?
You want to start?
Well, I think we, first and foremost, we look to identify what is the underlying problem that needs to be solved. Is it treatment of a civilian population at the hands of government? Is it persecution because of religious beliefs? Is it, the litany goes on. And by mobilizing our allies in multilateral contexts, and quite a bit bilaterally as well, the international community can come together both to exert persuasion, I guess I would diplomatically say, to ameliorate the circumstances that are leading to ill treatment. And we can also come together and join forces as donors to provide sort of the in-kind granular assistance that can help the really brave men and women who are working on the ground as activists to combat whatever the problems are. So I think it's really I don't know, it's two sides of the same coin in a way, but two very different approaches.
I certainly would agree with that. And it's sort of I would say a three-pronged approach. We engage with governments, the governments that are responsible for producing refugees, to say to those governments, cease and desist from your actions that are leading to these refugee flows. And we might put additional pressure on those governments by threatening our support to those governments and encouraging other governments to make those same threats. The second side of this is to engage with the governments where refugees are being received, because sometimes those governments are not hospitable, they're not welcoming, they're not abiding by the Geneva Convention. And so we have to push those countries to honor their commitments. And then the third part of this is engaging in the multilateral context with the UN, encouraging certain priorities and policies on the part of UN agencies who are working in these countries and supporting refugees and IDPs who have moved from their homes.
If I could ask one sort of final question here, as you're looking to the future, in the next few years, what are going to be the biggest challenges you think related to refugees and human rights?
I would say it is the youth bulge. We see a tremendous youth population in most countries around the world, with populations, for example, in Africa, where the median age is 19. And these young people don't have opportunity. They have very little hope because their countries are not able to provide prosperity for them. And so again, they start moving, and we're seeing these major migration flows of people crossing the Mediterranean, not as refugees in many cases, but in many cases seeking opportunity,
Right.
seeking jobs. And so we're going to have to, in the future, work with countries to figure out what they need to do to keep their populations at home, but also what we need to do to address the movements of those populations across borders, and how we can make those flows more orderly and less imposing on the countries where they are taking refuge.
You know, I also would say that, for example, as London noted, the youth bulge, I mean, where you have young children as part of a refugee population, they often can't get documentation. Without that documentation, they can't go to school. Without education, what future lies ahead for them? And, you know, I mean, these kids lead a pretty rough existence in refugee camps.
Yeah.
They're not exactly plush.
But I would add, having visited refugee camps recently, I'm always amazed at how hopeful young people are.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Kenya a couple of years ago with former Secretary Kerry, and he met with young people who had been born and educated and had lived their whole lives in a refugee camp. And there were young women who were saying, I want to be a pilot. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a teacher. And they developed those wants and desires living in a refugee camp. And if that's not hope for the future, I don't think there's anything else that we can look forward to. So there's always, I think there's always room for hope, and that's what we work for.
I think this was a very fruitful discussion, and a couple of points sort of hit me that came up during the discussions that we had. One is that there are serious issues with refugees, with human rights, with internally displaced people that have to be resolved with the support of the international community. And again, the United States and its diplomats play a very large role in leading efforts to resolve human rights issues, leading efforts to come up with new solutions to refugee problems. And I think that's one of the most important things that we talked about. And at the end of the discussion, a really important thing was that this these kinds of activities provide hope for people who are in very desperate situations, and they're trying to figure out how to survive this. And I think what the U.S. does, its engagement with these populations, provides hope for young people in particular, and that's a really important thing.